What happens when a man discovers a frozen, unconscious gray wolf in his yard? He thinks it's a lost animal, but what he finds next will shock you. This is a story of survival, trust, and an unexpected bond. You won't believe what happens when the truth comes to light. Stay tuned to see how everything changes. The cold winter air bit at James's face as he stepped out onto the porch of his cabin. The surrounding forest was blanketed in thick layers of snow, the world eerily quiet except for the occasional gust of wind rustling the bare branches of the trees. James had grown accustomed to this kind of isolation, the peace of nature his only companion. His dog, Max, trotted by his side, his breath forming little clouds in the icy air. But today, something was different. Max, normally a calm and steady companion, was agitated. He sniffed the ground, ears perked, his body tense. James watched, noticing the way the dog kept looking towards the woods, an unsettling feeling creeping over him. "What's got you so worked up, boy?" James muttered, rubbing his hand against the side of Max's head as he followed the dog's lead. Max barked, a sharp sound that broke the stillness, and immediately bounded toward the edge of the yard. James, heart racing slightly from the dog's urgency, followed, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. As he reached the tree line, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, lying half buried in snow, was a large, gray figure. At first, James thought it was just another animal, perhaps a deer that had been caught in the storm. But as he approached cautiously, he froze. It wasn't a deer. It was a gray wolf, its body rigid and lifeless, a patch of red staining the snow beneath it. The wolf was still breathing, but its breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. The sight of the creature lying there, so vulnerable and beaten by the cold, sent a chill down James's spine. What was a wild animal doing so far from its pack? And why was it lying here, so close to his home, as if waiting for someone to find it? James knelt beside the wolf, his fingers trembling as he reached out to touch its fur. The animal's body was freezing, and the snow around it was stained with the dark, slow drip of blood from a wound on its side. A deep gash, likely from a recent battle or a trap, had torn through the wolf's thick pelt. Max sniffed at the wolf's face, growling softly, sensing the danger in the situation. But there was something about the wolf's eyes, half open, glazed with pain, that seemed to hold a strange, unspoken connection. There was a look of helplessness in those eyes, something more than just the fear of an animal in distress. "Hang on, I'm going to help you," James muttered, almost to himself, unsure of why he felt so compelled to help the creature. It was wild, a force of nature meant to survive on its own, but something deep inside him told him this was no ordinary wolf. As he carefully shifted the wolf, trying to make it more comfortable, the creature let out a soft whine and shifted slightly. The action was small, but enough to send a wave of relief through James. The wolf was still alive, but for how long? He knew the clock was ticking, the temperatures were plummeting, and the wolf's injuries were severe. He had to make a choice, help it or leave it to fate. "Max, stay here," James said softly, his voice more to calm himself than the dog. He stood up, looking down at the wolf with determination. He had no idea how or why this was happening, but there was no turning back now. James didn't hesitate. He carefully lifted the wounded wolf into his arms, trying to be as gentle as possible, but the weight and stiffness of its body made it difficult. Max trotted alongside, watching his every move, his instincts sharp, alert to any danger. James knew the risks. He was alone in the wilderness, with no other help for miles. His cabin wasn't equipped to handle a wild animal, let alone one as large and dangerous as a wolf. But when the animal's eyes fluttered open again, locking onto his with a strange sense of recognition, it was as though the decision had already been made for him. With the wolf carefully secured in his arms, James made his way back to the cabin, the snow crunching beneath his boots. His heart pounded in his chest, and not just from the cold. There was a deep sense of urgency now, a feeling that he was in over his head, but he couldn't turn back. Inside the cabin, the warmth was almost unbearable after the frigid air outside. The small wood stove crackled, filling the room with a comforting glow, but the sight of the wolf lying motionless on the floor made the warmth seem somehow out of place. James quickly searched through his meager supplies, bandages, antiseptic, and old towels, as he tried to make the animal as comfortable as possible. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the situation. As he worked, the wolf's breathing steadied, though it still sounded labored. James spoke to it softly, more for his own reassurance than the creature's. "You're gonna make it. I won't let you die out there." But the more he examined the wolf, the more questions arose. The wound on its side was deep, but it wasn't just the blood loss that concerned him. There was something about the way the wolf moved that was off. It didn't act like any animal James had encountered before. Suddenly, the wolf let out a low growl, its eyes narrowing as it stared at James. James froze, his breath catching in his throat. Was the wolf aggressive? Or was it just scared? He had no idea, but he knew he had to remain calm. The last thing he wanted was to get injured while trying to help. He took a slow step back, giving the wolf space, but Max, sensing his owner's tension, stood between them, his growl low but steady. It was clear that Max was protective of James, and though he usually trusted the dog's instincts, he couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up his spine. This wasn't just a wolf. There was something more going on here. The wolf suddenly stopped growling, its body stiffening as it let out a soft whimper. It was clear now that it was in pain, but James still couldn't shake the feeling that the animal was trying to communicate with him. There was a deep intelligence in those eyes, something that seemed too human to be the mere survival instinct of a wild animal. "What are you?" James muttered under his breath, but before he could finish his thought, the wolf's body spasmed, its eyes rolling back in its head. James quickly moved to its side, trying to keep the animal still. He feared the worst. "Stay with me," he whispered, pressing a cloth against the wound to slow the bleeding. His heart raced as he realized how little he knew about what he was dealing with. The wolf was much more than a wild animal in need of help. There was a connection here, something that was slowly unraveling before him. Max barked, pulling James from his thoughts. The dog had his attention fixed on the door. James turned to look and saw something that made his blood run cold. James didn't take his eyes off the door. Max was growling now, low and steady, his fur bristling as he stood in front of the wolf, as though protecting it from something unseen. James followed the dog's gaze, but the yard was still. The only sound was the wind howling outside, sending waves of snow against the cabin's window. James took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. He returned to the wolf, his focus snapping back to the animal's labored breathing. For a moment, everything else faded away. The cold, the tension, the inexplicable feeling in the pit of his stomach. The wolf was still alive. It wasn't too late. But just as he leaned down to check its pulse, there was a loud knock at the door. James flinched, his heart hammering. Who would be out here at this time of night, in this storm? Max barked again, more aggressively this time, his tail stiff and his teeth bared. James's mind raced. He wasn't expecting anyone. He didn't want anyone to see the wolf. Not yet. Not until he understood what was happening. Another knock. This time, louder. "James? It's Ben," came a voice from the other side of the door. "I need to talk to you." James stood still for a moment, his mind whirling. Ben, the local wildlife officer? He hadn't seen Ben in months, not since the last time he helped with a bear sighting in the area. What could he possibly want? "James?" Ben's voice was more insistent now. "I know you're in there. Open up." Reluctantly, James crossed the cabin, leaving Max by the wolf's side. He unlocked the door, but before he could even open it fully, Ben pushed through, stepping inside with a heavy sigh. He was a tall, rugged man, his clothes caked in snow from the storm outside. "Is everything all right?" Ben asked, his eyes scanning the room. He stopped short when he saw the wolf lying motionless on the floor. James's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea how to explain it. How could he tell Ben that he found a wolf in his yard, half dead from an apparent attack, and that he was now trying to save it? Ben raised an eyebrow, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer to the animal. What is this?" James hesitated, his mind racing for an answer. "It was just out there in the snow. I thought it was dead, but it's alive." Ben knelt down to inspect the wolf, his face softening with a look of disbelief. That's a gray wolf, not common around here. It's a miracle it survived the night. James watched him carefully, a strange knot forming in his stomach. You think it'll make it? Ben glanced up, his brow furrowed. I don't know. Wolves don't usually survive this close to human homes, especially not alone. He paused, eyeing James. What exactly happened, James? You didn't just find it, did you? James swallowed hard. Ben's suspicion was clear. He didn't know what was happening, but he couldn't tell Ben the whole truth. Not yet. He wasn't even sure what the truth was. I don't know, James said quietly. It just showed up. Injured. I didn't know what else to do. Ben stood up, turning toward him with a mix of concern and confusion. We'll need to get it looked at. If it's as hurt as you say, there's no way you can keep it here alone. Before James could respond, Max growled again, this time with a hint of aggression. The dog's fur was standing on end, and his stance was more protective than ever. James turned to see the wolf's eyes open again, this time more focused, more alert. The room fell into a heavy silence, and for a moment, James thought he saw something in the wolf's gaze. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, more knowing. Ben looked at the wolf, then back at James. It's watching us. James felt a shiver run down his spine. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he felt the weight of something bigger, something he didn't fully understand, settling over him. That's not just any wolf, Ben muttered, his voice barely a whisper. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut through. Ben stood frozen, eyes locked on the wolf as it slowly rose to its feet, its limbs stiff from the cold but somehow determined. Its gaze shifted between the two men, and the silence that followed felt almost suffocating. Max's growl deepened, his body tense, as if waiting for a signal to protect James at any cost. I think we need to move it, Ben said, finally breaking the stillness. His voice was low, but there was an underlying urgency. This place isn't safe, not for any of us. James felt a knot tighten in his chest. He wasn't ready to let the wolf go, but Ben was right. The storm outside raged harder, and the wolf, though clearly injured, was still a wild animal, capable of anything in its pain. But there was something else gnawing at James's mind, something that didn't sit right. He didn't trust the sudden sense of urgency in Ben's voice. Why was Ben so insistent on moving the wolf? What did he know that James didn't? James met Ben's gaze, searching for answers, but Ben was already moving toward the door, his heavy boots scraping against the wooden floor. I'll get the truck, he said, a sharpness in his tone. You stay here with the wolf. Don't let it move too much. Before James could respond, Ben was out the door, disappearing into the blizzard. James stood there, uncertain. The wolf's breathing was still shallow, but its eyes were now locked on him, clear and steady, as if trying to communicate. The connection between them was undeniable. James could feel it, a magnetic pull, a strange understanding. But what was it? Was the wolf trying to warn him? Or was it merely reacting to the growing tension in the room? Max, still growling, stood at the doorway, ears perked, his body rigid. James felt a wave of frustration. He didn't understand what was going on. How had this simple encounter escalated so quickly? The air outside was frigid, and the snowstorm continued to lash against the windows. James felt trapped, caught between his desire to protect the wolf and the unsettling feeling that something was terribly wrong. The moment Ben returned, everything would change. But would it be for the better, or would it only bring more danger? Suddenly, the wolf shifted again, its body trembling as it struggled to stand. James rushed to its side, pressing his hand gently against its fur, feeling the warmth of its body despite the frostbite creeping along its limbs. Easy, James murmured, his voice soft but firm. I'm not going anywhere. You're safe here. The wolf's eyes flicked up to his face, and for the briefest of moments, James saw something that didn't belong in the eyes of a wild animal. It was a look of recognition, of understanding. It wasn't just a creature in distress. It was different, more human than animal. As James gently supported the wolf, a sudden movement outside caught his attention. Through the swirling snow, he could just make out the silhouette of Ben's truck pulling up in front of the cabin. But there was something off about the way Ben moved. He wasn't rushing to the door like someone eager to help. Instead, he was walking slowly, deliberately, and the expression on his face was unreadable. James felt a shiver run down his spine. What had happened out there in the storm? And why did he feel like Ben wasn't telling him the whole truth? Ben entered the cabin, shutting the door behind him. His eyes immediately locked onto the wolf, then back to James. He seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second, his gaze flickering between James and the animal. "We need to get it out of here, now," Ben said, his tone colder than before. James stood his ground. "Why? Why so urgent? What's going on, Ben?" Ben didn't answer immediately. He walked toward the wolf, but James stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "James, you don't understand. This isn't just a wolf. It's something else. Something dangerous." The words hit James like a blow to the chest. His breath caught in his throat and his heart skipped a beat. "Dangerous?" James repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about?" Ben exhaled sharply, his gaze darting nervously between James and the wolf. "You're in over your head. The sooner you get it out of here, the better." James's mind was racing. He wanted to demand answers, but something in Ben's expression, the way his eyes flicked nervously, made him realize that whatever was going on, it was much bigger than he had thought. The wolf, sensing the tension, growled softly. Its eyes shifted to Ben, then back to James. It seemed to recognize the danger in the air, too, and then, as if everything had happened in slow motion, the wolf let out a high-pitched, chilling howl. The sound echoed through the cabin, vibrating in the walls, and James felt his skin crawl. The howl was not just a call to the wild, it was a warning. The howl still hung in the air, its eerie resonance fading as quickly as it had come. James felt his pulse race, his heart pounding in his chest. The wolf's eyes were locked on him, pleading, desperate even. There was something about the way it looked at him that sent a chill down his spine. Ben was the first to speak, his voice now tinged with an unmistakable tension. "We can't keep it here, James. We need to get it out of here now." James turned to Ben, his hands trembling. "I don't understand. Why are you so afraid of it? This isn't just a regular wolf, is it?" Ben froze, his jaw clenching as if he were fighting to keep his composure. He swallowed hard, his eyes narrowing. "It's not what you think. It's something else, something dangerous." James took a step closer, his mind racing. "What do you mean something else? What's going on, Ben?" Ben shook his head, his gaze darting toward the door, as if he were looking for an escape. "I shouldn't have brought you into this. I thought it would be okay, but this is bigger than I thought." James's frustration boiled over. "I don't care about what you thought. I need to know what's going on. Why are you so scared of this wolf?" There was a long pause, and for a moment, James thought Ben might not answer. But then Ben spoke, his voice low and measured, as if every word weighed heavily on him. "Do you remember the stories? The old legends about the wolves in these parts?" Ben's eyes flicked nervously to the wolf, then back to James. "The ones about creatures that are more than just animals, things that can take on different forms, that aren't just natural wolves." James frowned, not fully understanding. "You mean, like a shapeshifter? That's just a myth." Ben's expression darkened. "That's what they want you to think, but I've seen it, heard it, and this wolf, it's one of them." James recoiled, the air feeling suddenly thick and oppressive. "Are you telling me this wolf is a shapeshifter, that it can transform?" Ben nodded, his eyes filled with an unsettling mixture of fear and determination. "Yes, and it's not just any shapeshifter. It's a part of something much older, something dangerous. These creatures, they've been living here for centuries, hidden in the wild, waiting for the right moment to strike." James's mind raced, his thoughts spinning. Was Ben really telling the truth? Or was this some kind of sick joke? He looked at the wolf again, its gaze steady, unblinking. It seemed so ordinary, so human in its eyes, that for a moment, James wondered if maybe Ben was right. The wolf let out another low growl, its body tense, as if it could sense the growing danger in the air. James's heart skipped a beat. If this was true, if this was really a creature from ancient folklore, then everything they had believed about the natural world was a lie. Ben stepped closer to James, his voice dropping to a whisper. Listen, we have to get it out of here before anyone else finds out. If they do, we won't just be fighting for our lives. We'll be fighting for everything we know, the whole town, the entire area. They'll be in danger. James felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. This couldn't be happening. It just couldn't. But the more he looked at the wolf, the more he studied its eyes, the more he began to question everything he thought he knew. I don't know what to do, James admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Ben's gaze softened, but only for a moment. You don't have to do anything. You just need to listen to me. We need to get it away from here before it's too late. Before James could respond, the wolf gave one final desperate howl. The sound was different this time, louder, more urgent, as if calling to something beyond the cabin, something out there in the storm. James's heart pounded. There was no going back. Whatever this wolf was, it wasn't just an animal, and whatever was coming next, they were all about to face it, together. The storm outside had turned into a full-blown blizzard. The wind howled relentlessly, rattling the windows, while the snow piled higher and higher, as if nature itself were conspiring against them. Inside the cabin, however, there was an unsettling calm. James and Ben stood at opposite ends of the room, the wolf between them. James could feel the weight of the air pressing down on him, heavy with unspoken words, and the tension that seemed to pulse in every corner of the room. The wolf, now standing, was alert, its fur bristling as it scanned the room. Its eyes flicked between James and Ben as if it could sense the impending danger. Ben was pacing, his brow furrowed with worry. It's not safe anymore, he muttered to himself. If it stays here... James stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the wolf. It wasn't just a wolf. He had seen it before, the way it moved, the way it seemed to understand them. Ben, we can't keep running from this. Whatever it is, it's already here. We need to face it. Ben stopped in his tracks, looking at James as if he were seeing him for the first time. You don't get it. You can't just face it. You can't fight this. It's not just a wolf anymore. It's a part of something much bigger, something ancient. James clenched his fists, the fire in him rising. Then let's end it. Whatever it is, whatever it wants, we stop it here. For the first time, the wolf lowered its head, a low growl rumbling in its chest. The room seemed to vibrate with the force of it, and James felt a shiver run down his spine. The tension was suffocating. He could feel it, the weight of the creature's presence, like it was watching them, waiting for them to make the first move. Ben took a hesitant step forward, then froze. It's not just us, James. There's something else here, something that controls them, something that... Before Ben could finish, the door burst open with a violent crack. The wind howled through the cabin, snow swirling around them like a whirlpool. James instinctively moved to protect the wolf, but as the door swung wide, a shadow appeared in the doorway. A figure, tall, cloaked, a face hidden beneath a hood. It's time, the figure said in a low, guttural voice that seemed to resonate with the storm outside. Ben's eyes widened in recognition. No, not now, not like this. The figure stepped into the room, the storm's fury at its back. You've already crossed the line, Ben. You've awakened something you can't control. James stood his ground, his breath shallow but steady. Who are you? The figure's eyes glinted, the dark void beneath the hood betraying no emotion. I am the one who has been watching, the one who has been waiting for this moment. The wolf you saved. It's only the beginning. The wolf's growl grew louder, and James could feel the power of its presence swelling, like a force beyond anything he had ever known. This is your last chance, the figure continued, its voice carrying the weight of finality. Walk away, or join us. Ben's face twisted with a mix of fear and regret. I didn't want this. I didn't want you to come back. James was ready. His resolve had hardened. Whatever this is, whatever you're planning, it ends tonight. For a moment, the room was silent. The The wolf, Ben, the mysterious figure. Everything held its breath, and then, in a flash of motion, the wolf lunged forward, its powerful jaws snapping just inches from the figure's face. The figure recoiled, but it was clear that the wolf's attack had no effect. It merely brushed the creature aside as if it were nothing. But that was all it took. In that moment of distraction, James acted. With a speed he didn't know he possessed, he grabbed a nearby lantern and hurled it at the figure. The glass shattering in a burst of fire. The flames ignited, and the figure staggered back, disappearing into the blizzard as quickly as it had arrived. Silence. The wolf stood beside James, its body tense, its fur bristling with the aftershock of battle. James turned to Ben, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Ben was staring at him, a look of awe on his face. "You did it. You stopped it." James didn't know how to respond. The storm outside still raged, but inside, the air felt lighter, freer. The battle was over, but the journey, he knew, was just beginning. Looking at the wolf once more, James knew that their bond was something that would endure. The creature may have been ancient, but its connection to him was undeniable. They had faced the darkness together, and in that moment, James realized that he was no longer afraid of the storm. The wolf would always be by his side, and whatever came next, they would face it together. As the storm finally began to fade, James realized the true power of the bond between him and the wolf. They had faced the darkness together, and now nothing seemed impossible. Their journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe, like, and share it with someone who believes in the power of courage and connection. Don't miss out on more incredible tales like this.